Aleph. We're starting from the Mishnah 3 lines from the top. The Mishnah says, Kol hanechal b'shara gadol. So we're talking about the carbon pesach. What part of the carbon pesach could you eat to be mekayim the mitzvah? So if the type of meat by a cow, a shara gadol yachel, that people eat it for a cow, so therefore when you have your carbon pesach with the gedi harach, with the kid, right? And we know that the carbon pesach is from 8 days old till a year. So whatever you could eat by a cow normally, in a let's say in a restaurant, that type of meat that's eaten there, but by the gedi also, if you that's what you're mekayim the mitzvah. And not only that, the Mishnah says you also mekayim the mitzvah carbon pesach, the achilas carbon pesach with the roshe kanofayim. Rashi says that's part of the shoulders, the shoulder blades, v'has chusim. And Rashi says that's part of the ear, part of the chest, the ribs, the sides. So you mekayim that. So we'll see in the Gemara now. Rabba Rami. Rabba asked the question. Tanat, we learned that Mishnah, Kol hanechal b'shara gadol, anything that's eaten by a grown cow. Now Rashi in the Mishnah says by a cow, it's already, everything is hardened, right? Whatever, it's not going to get any more harder to that piece of meat. So if you can eat that piece of meat while it's hard by a shara gadol, so by the gedi harach, you could eat it even though eventually it might harden more, but that's okay for that piece of meat. So that's what it says. But if something, part of the cow you don't eat because it's not edible, so then you cannot eat it by the gedi harach. But for the Gemara aim a seifa. Look at the seifa. It says that from the gedi, you could take the rosh kanofayim, you could take the shoulder blades, vas chasusim. But hohani, those parts, like misachli b'shara gadol, those you cannot eat. They're not edible by a cow, so why could you eat it of the gedi? The Mishnah says if you can't eat it by the cow, you can't eat it by the gedi. The Gemara says Tanai. That's a machlokes Tanai v'hachik Tani. Kol hanechal b'shara gadol. Some part of the animal, the meat that you eat by a cow, yachol gedi harach. V'she'ein hanechal. If you cannot eat it by the cow, you cannot eat it by gedi. Lo. But the yesh omrim, that's what the Mishnah says. The yesh omrim, af roshe kanofayim v'chasusim. Some people say, even though by a shara gadol you can't eat those things, the only way you could eat the shoulder blades and the ear parts and the breast and the chest is only by a shara gadol, only if you cook it. Rashi says bishlika. Rashi says, and shlika is bishul yoser. You really gotta cook it to soften it up a little bit. You won't soften up too much, but it is edible only through a cooking process, a long cooking process. So since you could somehow eat it by a shara gadol, we allow it by gedi harach. That's what the Mishnah says.
Sli, I mean, it's not bishul, it's soft as sli, right?
No, we're not talking about sli. By gedi, it's soft, or it's softer than a shara gadol. A cow, a full cow, those parts are hard like a rock. You can't eat it. The only way you'll be able to eat it is if you cook it with a shlika. So therefore you could roast it by a gedi harach and eat it and be mekayim the mitzvah. Right? Now by the gedi harach, at that point, it's such a young kid, right, that it's soft. But eventually it's going to get hardened. Now the mitzvah carbon pesach is, even though now it's soft, but if that part of the animal is going to get hardened later in life, so that's not really a piece of meat. So maybe you shouldn't. So therefore the chiddush is that you could be mekayim the mitzvah of carbon pesach. Right? Okay, and then Rava also explains the Mishnah, like since there was a question, he explains it with a little twist. Ma'hek dani, the Mishnah says. V'hachik dani. Kol hanecha b'shara gadol b'shalka. If some part of a cow, you could eat it with a cooking process, and that's like Rashi says, a bishul yoser, yochel b'gedi harach b'tzli. That part you could eat by gedi harach with by roasting it. Umahein, and what is that? Rosh kanafayim v'chasusim. Tanya kavase de Rava. Kol hanechal b'shara gadol b'shalka, yochel b'gedi harach b'tzli. Umahein. What are those parts? Rashi kanafayim v'chasusim, and then the Brisa ends off and says the gidin harachin. In other words, the soft gidin, the sinews are lidun and kibasar, have a din basar, and if you eat those gidin harachin, you can be mekayim the mitzvah of achilas carbon pesach. Itmar. Now we quote it says Gidin shesayfa lahakshos. You have the Gidin that eventually, even though now they're soft, but eventually they will harden. Rashi says they are the Gidei Tzavar. They are the veins of the neck. Uvigdi v'tleh, and by a sheep, hey rachem, they are very soft. Avlim hayom maskin, if they get a little older, then sofa liyas kashim. They will eventually harden and they won't be edible. But at this point, now in the animal, since it's so young, like we explained, the mitzvah carbon pesach is bagdi. It could be from 8 days. It can't be younger than 8 days up to a year. So since those gidei tzavar are soft, so it isn't machlokes. Rabbi Yechanan Amar Ninan Aleh Pesach. You could be mekayim your the carbon pesach. You could include yourself with that gidin to be mekayim the mitzvah. And Rish Lakish Amar Einin Aleh Pesach. Rabbi Yechanan Amar Ninan Aleh. Why? Because basa hashtas lina. Right now, at this age of the kid, of the animal, it's soft, so therefore it's edible, and therefore you can be mekayim the mitzvah of carbon pesach. Rosh Lakish Amar ein in the malayim because basar b'seifas lina. Eventually, when it gets older, like Rashi says, it's going to harden, so therefore you cannot be mekayim the mitzvah. Now, Taisus doesn't like what Rashi says. In other words, Rashi explains that these gidim are the gidar tzavar, right, of the neck. And if anybody remembers from yesterday, in other words, we said that gidar tzavar are not, you can't be mekayim. This is what Taisus says. Pirish bekuntras gidar tzavar ve'nira l'riva. But mashma dehashtehem rachim kibasar legamrei, right? It's mashma, according to Rashi, they're soft now, but ule'il kamar, we learned yesterday, is nicer. They ain't really achel. Yesterday we learned that the gidar tzavar, automatically you can't eat it, they automatically become nosa, we learned yesterday. So how could you say here that they are soft? Therefore Taisus says that when it says gidin shesayva lahakshos, it doesn't refer to the neck. Taisus says it refers to the gidei shedra, v'gidem arachim, softer ones that eventually will harden. But it can't be the gidei tzavar. So if anybody remembers from yesterday, according to Rashi, it doesn't make sense what we're saying here, that they're soft, because yesterday in the Gemara, it seemed to say that they are hardened, ein roi la'achil, and therefore they automatically you can leave over to become noser. So you have machlokes Rabbi Yechanan and Rish Lakish. If you go basar hashda, they're soft now, and therefore you can be mekayim the mitzvah. Or you go basar saif according to Rish Lakish, and you're not mekayim the mitzvah carbon pesach. Ace for Rish Lakish Rabbi Yechanan. It says kol anechel b'shara gadol. In our Mishnah it says, any part of a cow that you eat when it's fully grown, yoachel, that part of the cow, you could eat that part b'gdi harach. By the kid, by the young kid, by the sheep. Umahin, what are they? We say Rashik and Ofayim v'Chsusim. That's mashma only Hani Ein, because by Ashar Gadol we said through a cooking process they soften up a little bit. So therefore by Gedi Arach you could be mekayim the mitzvah, but it's mashma Al Gidin shesayfa lahakshos, but Gidin that eventually are going to harden like a rock, you can never eat it. Lo. So you see that what? That you go basar, not hashta, you go basar sofo. So how does Rabbi Yechanan say you could? It's okay. Amalei, no. Tana Hani. When the Mishnah says the Rosh Hashanah means these Fuadin Lahanach, even the Gidei Shesayfa Lahakshos, according to Rashi and according to Taisus. Plus Hani, this Rosh Hashanah v'Sachusim, my time. Why do we allow it? Because the Masachle B'Shraga B'Shalka, because they are eaten by a full grown cow. When you cook it in the bishul yoser, aninami misachli bishar gadol bishalka. So these gidei shesayfa lahakshos, since you could really cook it with a bishul yoser, like we said, by a shar gadol, therefore you can be mekayim the mitzvah even by gdi harach. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Avin. Ki azlu kamid Rav Avua. When you come to Rav Avua, do me a favor. Ramele, ask him this question. Did Rabbi Yechanan say Gidin shesofa lahakshos, even though they're soft now, but eventually they're going to harden like a rock? That nimnim aleim bepesach. Alma, you're saying Rabbi Yechanan holds basa hashtas lina right now they're soft, but v'habayim and Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yechanan. Rish Lakish asked a question from Rabbi Yechanan that ar haroy shel egel, the skin of the head of an egel arach, of a very young calf, right? So Rashi says, what does that mean? When is the egel arach? Rashi says, kol zman sheyonek, when that calf is still nursing from its mom, V'ar rosho, therefore the skin of its head is rach, and the way you could eat it is molgin also. You could put hot water on it. V'nechalima, you could eat it with the animal. So that are mao sheyitameh. Is it considered an ochel that it gets a tumas oichlin? In other words, because right now it's soft, so therefore it should get a tumas oichlin, or later on it's going to harden, right? When it doesn't nurse anymore, it's going to be hard, and therefore it shouldn't get a din, it's not a din oichel, and therefore it shouldn't be mitame. V'amaloi, and what did Rabbi Yechanan answer? He answered, a mitame. Because it's going to harden later on. So we see Rabbi Yechanan holds alma basar b'seifas linan. So Rabbi Yechanan says, you go, what's going to happen? Not now. So that's the stira between Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Yechanan. Amalei, so Ravua said, the Rama lachak, if somebody asks such a question, lechosh lekimche, he doesn't care much about his flour. Rashi says that he doesn't pay attention what he's doing. So also when you're asking this question, you're not paying attention. In other words, because you shouldn't ask such a question. Because we know, we know even though he said once that you go basar hashta, that stop, but we know Rabbi Yechanan had charata, the gabid Rish Lakish. V'amelei, we know Rabbi Yechanan said, al tachtiteni shebelashin yachid ani shono. So that brisa was only lashin yachid. I made a mistake. In other words, you don't go basar hashta, you go basar sof. It's going to harden, and therefore it's not royal achila, it's not metamet tumas eichlin, and you cannot be mekayim the mitzvah of carbon pesach.
Even if it's hard, you wouldn't only consider it achila, right? Achil. I mean, he has nothing else to eat. He'll eat it. No?
If you're going to break your teeth, you won't be able to eat it. So you're going to have to be, that's the heter, that you could be bishul yoser. You could cook it very much, right?
Pound it and grind it up.
Grind it up. But then you don't have any taste on it. You know, you have to have ala soiva, you have to eat, you have to enjoy.
No, if you want to go
Mishnah. So the Mishnah. Asher be'ez ha'etzem be'pesach hatar. In other words, we know that you're not allowed to break the bone of a carbon pesach. So if somebody breaks the carbon pesach hatar, in other words, everything is fine, everybody is tar, the carbon pesach is kosher, then aizel like rabban, you get malchus. You're not allowed to do it. It's a lav in the Torah. But havala moisi bitar, if somebody leaves over bitar, that means a regular noser. A guy has a carbon pesach, everything's fine. You sat down at your seder, you ate your carbon pesach, and you had leftovers. The next morning, what happens? They're leftovers. What do you have to do with it?
Burn it.
When do you burn it?
In the morning.
You can't burn it in the morning, we learned yesterday.
The next day.
Next day you have to burn it because it's Yom Tov, right? So that noser, in other words, you left it over, right? And Rashi said yesterday, nisatzel. It wasn't that he couldn't eat it. He was just lazy. He didn't want to eat a nachash nickel. He was nisatzel. So maybe you should get, it says like siru. You're not allowed, there's a law. Maybe you should get malchus. No. The Mishnah says, ain't eloke if you leave over bitar. And even vashover, and also vashover b'tomei, if you have a carbon pesach that was done b'tuma, right? So it's not a kosher. So if you break the bones of that carbon pesach, ain't a like his arbaim. So it's like the Gemara, bishleim b'maisi b'tar. If somebody leaves over his carbon pesach, a good carbon pesach, we know that you don't get malchus. Why? The Tanya, we explained it yesterday. It says like siru menu haboker. You're over a lav. So at that point, you should get malchus. But it says v'anaysev menu haboker, but eis t'srafena. Tisrifle. So it's a lav and nitek lasei. But kasal eaten asay acher. The Torah gives you an asay to get out of the loisa asay. That's a lav and nitek lasei. She'ena, like Rashi says, the bottom line, kol lav she'nitek lasei. In other words, the asay takes away the lav. Ain't like an all of the mashmizu itakanta. The Torah allows you to get away. If you burn it, you do the asay, you won't get malchus. Im tavor alav asay zois v'inatel, you get saved from the malchus. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yaakov omer lo yimuna Hashem was it. That's not the reason why you don't get malchus on noser. The reason why you don't get malchus on noser when you leave it over, el mishum tav lav shem by maisa ve'ena like a lav. You didn't do a maisa on this lav. You basically went to bed, and the meat was in the kitchen. So you didn't do anything. So now you wake up in the morning, boom, it's nicer. Lashem emaisa, eina like an olav. Now, so that's we understand Maisa B'tar, you don't get malchus. Where do you know if you break the bone of a Tamei Dika carbon pesach that that you're not get malchus. The Amakra, we learned this yesterday. You're not allowed to break the bone of a carbon pesach. Boy be kosher. The carbon pesach has to be kosher. V'loi be pasul. Since it's tamei, you don't get malchus. Taner rabbanon v'etzel and sister boy be kosher. V'loi be pasul. Rebbe Yomer, the reason why you don't get malchus on something that's possible, because the Torah says, "B'bayis echad yoachel," eat your carbon pesach, and then it says, "Etzon le'sishru bay." So since these psukim are right next to each other, so the Torah is telling you, "Kol aryai lachila," something that you could eat the carbon pesach, then you're not allowed to break. Yesh by mishum shveres etzim, you get malchus on that if you break it. But v'she'enu aryai lachila, something that's tamei that you can't even eat, ein by mishum shveres etzim. So my benayu, what is the difference between the Tanakama and Rebbe? I'm Rebbe Yirmiyah. Pesach haba b'tumike benayu. When the tzibor is all tamei by Pesach Rishon. So in other words, we know that Tumah is the Chuya B'tzibur, and you're allowed to bring the carbon Pesach, right? So Lamanda Amar Kosher Hai Puzzle. In other words, this is still considered puzzle. Rashi explains why. Because even though you're allowed to do it, Shenasa B'puzzle, Rashi says, the Tumah T'chuyahu B'tzibur. In other words, it's only techuya, so it's not hutra. So it's only really a b'di'evet techuya, like we learned. It's like, okay, we'll do you a favor, we'll let you do it. The Torah says, really, you shouldn't do it b'tumah, but we allow you to do it since the raif, the tzibur is all tamei, tumah techuya b'tzibur. So we allow you to be mekayim the mitzvah. You don't have to redo it Pesach Sheni, but really, it's still a puzzle. It's still tamei. So therefore, according to Mandam, that the ikar has to be a kosher to get malchus on the breaking of the bone. This is, even though you brought a betuma, which is allowed to be mekayim mitzvah, but in actuality it's still puzzle. Therefore you don't get malchus if you break the bone of that one. But according to the mandam roy lachila, hainami roy lachila. Since the tumah t'chuy b'tzibur, you're allowed to eat it, right? You eat it, you sit down, you eat it. So you see that it's roy lachila, and therefore if you break that bone of that carbon pesach, you are chayiv malchus. Rabbi Yosef Amar no. If it's tamei, even though the Torah allowed you, because tumah t'chuy b'tzibur, if you break the bone of that carbon pesach, you don't get malchus. Why? The Rebbe la kule kase, and therefore v'hai ha-pasalu. It is pasal. It's tamei. Ella. When would there be a difference? If this carbon Pesach was okay on the 14th day, then the nifsal became puzzle. So since at one point it was kosher, kosher at the point of the avodah of the carbon Pesach, therefore her kosher who, and therefore you cannot break the bone of this carbon Pesach. If you do it, you get malchus. Even though the avodah was done okay, but right now it was nifsal when you sat down at the seder. And therefore you would not get malchus if you break the bone. No. If it became puzzle later on by the achila, everybody holds you don't get malchus on breaking the bone. Because my time the difference will be a guy that broke the bone on Erev Pesach, right? Then when it's not the time to eat. He broke the bone on Erev Pesach. The mandamar kosher, then it's a kosher. It's a kosher one. But l'mandamar royal achila, during the day, on the 14th, hashla bar achilu, it's not the time. It's not Seder yet. So therefore, if you broke the bone that time, you won't get malchus on it. So Meisvei, Rabbi Yomer, it says, Nimnin al moach sheberosh. You could be mekayim the mitzvah of carbon pesach. Nimnin means you are counted in your group.
Register.
You're registered, that's a good word. You are counted on with your group, and then if you eat it, al moach sheberosh. The marrow in the head of the animal, that's going to be your part, you could be mekayim the mitzvah of carbon pesach. But they nimnar mal moach shebekulyos. But you cannot be mekayim the mitzvah of carbon pesach of the marrow of the thigh bone. Why? So the Gemara explains. Al moach sheberosh, the marrow, because to get to the marrow, what do you have to do to the animal? You got to break the bone, but you're not allowed to. So you're not going to get to it. So therefore the Gemara explains, Al moach sheberosh, the marrow in the head, even though there are bones, my timer, why could you be mekayim the mitzvah with that marrow? There's a way to get it, Rashi says, through the nostrils. You can get that you're going to say it, right?
That's the way it is now. That's how you get it.
Whatever happens in the kitchen, who cares? The main thing, it comes out nice and looks good when it comes to the table.
You never watch how they cook food. That's
right.
Cool.
But that's the joke. A guy is in a hotel and they found treif there in the kitchen. So they asked the guy, this Hasidic guy is eating in the dining room. They asked him, they found treif in the kitchen. He says, who cares what goes on in the kitchen? I eat in the dining room. I don't care what goes on in the kitchen. So that's also with preparing the food, right? So Gemara says, Hoyel.
By the way.
What's that?
You're on video, right?
Yeah. I said it in a nice way. My time, Hoyel. My time, Hoyel v'yachal l'gayer l'yitzia. Because you can get it out of the head through the nostrils, right? Rashi says very nicely, the fourth narrow line, with a toothpick. You can scrape it and get that marrow out somehow.
It's more details.
Right? But but by the thigh bone, the only way you can get out the moach is through breaking it. You're not allowed to break it, therefore you cannot be mekayim Mr. Korban Pesach of that. But for the Gemara now, if you break the bone on Erev Pesach, not by Seder, it's okay, right? So Kulyas Nami, the thigh bone, why don't it break it Erev Yontiv, and put the marrow on a plate, right? And then and roast it together with other stuff.
But isn't the mitzvah to eat the meat?
So moach is basar. Marrow is basar. Yeah. That's what we learned yesterday.
One question.
So Malach Abaya, 1 second. If you're saying about breaking the thigh bone by joim, I have another eitzah. Even when it comes to the Seder night, I'll give you an eitzah to get the marrow out of the thigh bone without breaking it. You know what you do? Neisa gumrasa, bring a coal, put it put it on a hot coal on the thigh bone, and guess what? The nikla start burning that thigh. It's going to soften up, and guess what? Without breaking the bone, and you'll take out the marrow. And go ahead and eat it. So Tanya, we learned, maybe you're not allowed to burn a bone. No. Hasayir vatzamos, if somebody burns, you're not allowed to break the bone of a Korban Pesach, but if you burn the bone of a Korban Pesach, or v'amachateh begidim, there's no ein boy mishum shviras etzem. It's not included in the lav. So why can't you do it that way, with the coal? Why are we not allow you to do it with burning a coal on the thigh bone? Because even though you are burning it, Rashi says that it might crack. In other words, Rashi says, even though here, where it's hot, it's just going to soften up. But because it gets softened here, it's going to crack. It's going to break in the other side. Therefore, you can't do that. And that's considered broken. Right? And Rava says, B'shum hefsed kachim. The reason why you can't burn it is because the kamasle b'yidayim. When you burn the thigh bone, guess what? That fire is going to burn part of the marrow. And therefore, you mafsid kaidish. It's a Korban Pesach. Now, there's a machlokas if it burns all the marrow or some of it. But still, you're causing damage.
It's burning, it's wasting.
Right, therefore, and it's kachim.
Right.
Has to kachim, the kamafli be dying, so we don't allow that way of getting the marrow out. Right? So therefore, since at nighttime we don't allow it, so therefore, nami we say, therefore, even breaking the bone of the thigh, Erev Yantiv, which is allowed, but we don't allow it. Rabbanan came along and made a gzeira. So the only marrow that you can be mekayim the mitzvah of Korban Pesach is the marrow of the head, but not of the thigh bone, because there the only way to get the marrow is through breaking the bone, and you're not allowed to do it. Or a gzeira. If the kol, that's a gzeira. Papa Amar. Even though, if you're going to say Erev Pesach, I could break the bone, no. If you break the bone Erev Pesach, in other words, even though it's not the time to eat at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you'll still be over the lab. My timer, because at nighttime you're going to be able to eat it. Even though right now it's just not the right time. So therefore you're not allowed to break it. And therefore there won't be a machlokas in that. But the machlokas is a limb that went out, Rashi says, chutz l'choimish Yerushalayim. In other words, part of the animal that you're using for the Korban Pesach went outside Yerushalayim. So that part that went out is puzzle, right?
After a shechted time? When did it go out?
Right.
Shechted in that piece.
Right. V'tzorach lachtach as ayotze. Now you have to cut off the part that went out. But when you're cutting it, you might break the bone. So what are you going to do? That's ikbenayu. Manda amar kosher hakosher, because you could eat it. How do you do that? The part of the animal that's inside Chaim Yerushalayim you could eat. Rashi says the way you do it is hainami kosher, sharaptimi kosher. The part of the animal that was inside the chayma is kosher. You can't break it. So how do you get the inside off the animal? You cut till you get to the bone. Start cutting off the meat that went outside, or the one that you want to eat inside. Cut the meat, which is okay at that point. Then v'kolev, you peel everything out at shemagia leperech, the joint. And there, v'chotech, that's not really breaking. Once you peel off the meat, you could be chotech, and therefore you could save the panimi that was inside to eat it. So therefore it's kosher, it's okay. And therefore, you'll get, if you break that bone, you will get malchus. The outside one is ein halav barachilo. Kedatanya Rabbi Shmuel ben Aisha Riach beBreika Aimer Evish Yatzim Miktsasa v'Shavro. According to him, holds ein ba mishum shver ze'etzem, because right now it's puzzle, and therefore you don't get malchus. Rav Shisha Breda of Ida Amar. This aver that went outside, there's no isser on breaking the bone. The har aver who pasalu. What is the case? What is the machlekes about breaking a bone? It means shviras etzem b'na. When you broke the bone while it's still raw, you didn't roast it yet, and then you break the bone. So right now, when it's raw, it can be mandam a kosher. You're just going to roast it. It's a kosher to get animal. Therefore, if you break the bone, you're a chayiv. But mandam roy lachila, since it's raw, you didn't roast it yet. Hashta ain't a raw lachila, and therefore, if you break the bone at that point, when it's raw, you didn't do any roasting yet. You're not chayiv malchus. Rav Nachbar Yitzchak Amar, no, kol kai gavne yesh ba mishum shviras etzem. Even though when it's raw, my time, because you're going to roast it. Achazal lachila, the matfile, you're going to roast it vachale. So therefore, even though you broke it before, you're chayiv on breaking the bone. Ella, the machlokas will be shviras ha'alya kebenayu, by breaking the tail. The tail goes to the mizbeach. Right? So the mandam kosher was saying it's a kosher to get animal, but the mandam roy lachila, the tail ha ain't a roy lachila. The murim that of the tail goes the alya legevaya salka, that goes to the mizbeach. Rav Ashi Amar kol ki gavna vade ein ba mishum shver zatzen. Why? It's going to the mizbeach. So if you break the bone in that tail, you're not chayiv. It means you're talking about an aver, a limb that doesn't have a kzayis basar on it. We say it's kosher. You need a kazayis basar to become the mitzvah, and therefore if you break the bone, you're not chayiv. Ravina Amar kol ka'agavna les by mishum shver zatzen. Why? To be in shirachila. You need a kazayis basar on the bone, and if you don't have it, you're not chayiv. It's talking about an aver she'ein alu kazayis basar makom zeh. There's a limb that doesn't have a kazayis basar at that point, but at the other end, the yesh alu kazayis basar makom achar yikbenai. L'manda amar kosher. It's kosher. L'manda amar royal achila binan shirachila b'makom shvira. Where you're breaking it, even though the other side of the limb has meat, but where you're breaking it, there's no basar, and therefore veleka you won't be chayiv. So Tanya now karboy minayu. We have a brisa that quotes 4 of the shitas that we just learned. The Tanya Rebbe Omer, it says bebayis echad yoachel. You eat it korban pesach ve'etzem loisishbru bay. So it says ala kosher hu chayiv ve'ina chayiv ala pasal. And what is that? So the Bryce explains. Kosher. If once it was good, and then you did the avoda of the korban pesach, then v'nifsal b'shas achila, when you're ready to eat, all of a sudden it becomes, let's say, tamei, ein bo mishum shviras etzem. If you break it at that point, there's no shviras etzem. But yeshba, and also yeshba mishir achila. If that bone has shir achila, yeshba mishum shviras etzem. Ein bo shir achila, ein bo mishviras etzem. Then the Bryce says, aroy lemizbeach. In other words, the alya, ein bo mishum shviras etzem. If b'shas achila yesh bo mishum shviras, then b'shas achila yesh bo mishum shviras etzem. Only when you're eating it. Shloi b'shas achila. If it's not the time of this when you're supposed to eat, b'boy joyim ein bo mishum shviras etzem. That's the brisa. Now, if you look at Rashi quotes how it comes out like 4 of the Amoraim that explained beforehand. Rashi said, "Hey, pasuk kamamai, hoysel shasa koisha v'nifsal, ein bo mishmur za'etzem, v'Rebbe Garcina bereisha v'haina Rabbi Yosef." That is Rabbi Yosef. That's number 1. Lemizbeach ulemute alya is Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Shloi b'shas achilu v'bod yom is Gedalia. The Amar v'bod yom asa. Rabbi Lemute Shirachilu Makom Shvira Karavina. So that is Inami Lemute Ein Ol Ksayis Karavashi. Those are the 4 Tanoim. Let's just end off. Itmar Avish Ein Ol Ksayis Basar b'Makom Zeh. If a limb doesn't have basar on one side, but the Yesh Ol Ksayis Basar b'Makom Achar, Rabbi Yechanan Amar, even though it doesn't have meat on this side, yesh ba mishum shveres etzem, because on the other side it has. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar ein ba mishveres etzem. Eis Rabbi Yechon Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. It says ve'etzem leisishbru bai. You can't break a bone. Echad etzem sheyesh olav kazayis basar, and even a bone ve'echad etzem she'ein olav kazayis basar. So what does it mean? My ein olav kazayis basar. What does it mean? A bone that doesn't have kazayis basar. E lema de ein olav kazayis basar klal. If there's no meat at all on it. There's no kazayis on it. Must be when it says ain't olav means elahachikam in this corner, in this side of the aver doesn't have elahachikam echad etzem sheyesh olav kazayis basar b'makom zeh ve'echad she'ein olav kazayis b'makom zeh v'yesh olav kazayis basar b'makom achar. Right. So it says that even though that there's no meat here, but there's meat there, that you are chayiv. So it's a kasha. So amalei loy. It means like this. Hachi kamar. Echad etzem sheesh al kazayis basar b'bachutz. It's not referring where the meat, there's no kazayis on one side. It has meat, a bone that has meat on the outside, right on top of the bone, then for sure you're chayiv if you break it. But even ve'echad etzem she'ein al kazayis basar b'chutz. Let's say there's no meat at all on the bone on the outside. But, you know where there is? V'yesh al kazayis basar b'fnim. There is basar inside the bone. What is that? The marrow. It has marrow, right? So there you would be chayiv. Because b'makayim eshavira, and you break it there, that's where you are chayiv. And should we go on, or should we stop here? I think we'll stop here. Keep going? Okay, and Tanya, and we learned a brisa. Rashi says benechusa. It's not a question; it's a proof. Because it says ve'etzem my sister Rabbi echad etzem sheish by moyach ve'echad etzem she'ein by moyach. That you can't break. Umani mikayim v'achlas abasa b'lay lazeh b'basa shal gabe etzem. You're mikayim with the meat on the bone, but oyein el b'basa shepetayich etzem. Maybe we could be mikayim the mitzvah of Korban Pesach with the marrow in the bone. Umani mikayim ve'etzem my sister Rabbi means be'etzem she'ein by moyach. If there's no marrow. But if you have marrow in there, maybe you are allowed to break the bone. Don't say, oh, how could you do that? You're over allowed. The assay of Korban Pesach will push away the law of breaking a bone. Therefore, it says it again that you're not allowed to break it. Kfar already says so since it says a second time, must be it's telling you even if the bone has marrow, you're not allowed to break it. Right? So how do you mekayim the marrow with marrow Korban Pesach? Only through the marrow in the head, where you can get it out through the nostrils. Yasha koach.